Hey, what's up guys? Node Investor here. Taking a look at the Bitcoin price action here today. We're seeing a little bit of selling pressure showing up. We were starting to see a little bit of the warning signals late yesterday, and sure enough today, seeing that play out. We're bouncing a little bit right now, so I'm going to go into the details there. You can see here I've got the parallel channel that I've been watching here. The lower trend line really is the most important thing to make note of here, and that's really been holding at this point so far, holding up. There was an undercut wick, big washout, bouncing a little bit here, but certainly caution remains, and I'll go into why I'm thinking that in a few different areas here, both on the short-term time frame as well as on the daily time frame. Looking at the alerts here on nodeinsiders.com, you can see the market reading right now is caution, which makes sense. The 4-hour chart is certainly in the red. The daily is still holding up, and we'll take a look at that here. So not bad all in all. If you go to the watch list here, some of the strong names today: Ethereum Classic, IOTA, Raven continues to just power through, continues to move up. We'll take a look at that chart here shortly, but a few other names here on the Bittrex side. Certainly some names moving here. Numier, there's a name from yesteryear, but not a lot of the other big cap names. Most of them are following suit with BTC, Litecoin, Ethereum, EOS, all pulling back. Binance Coin, I mentioned that we were seeing some potential distribution showing up there. That is playing out as well. So let's get to it here. Looking at the 4-hour chart first, most importantly, what I was looking at yesterday was this bearish divergence that was starting to show up. You can see here as well on the MACD histogram. We were seeing a new price high, but look at the MACD histogram. Just barely tucked in the green, started to roll over. If you looked at the 1-hour chart, it was showing the same type of price action here. So I posted this chart yesterday in the Slack group as I was seeing this starting to develop, saying, hey, maybe this is where Bitcoin takes a breather. Perhaps we see that next higher low form from here. And then early in my day, waking up to a failed breakout attempt here. So we were seeing this price action, and by the time I started looking at the charts, it was already down here at around 4,020, give or take, in that range. And I didn't like the way this was looking on the 1-hour chart, and so I decided to actually close out. It was a lucky break for me just because it was a quick scalp trade. Closed out, raised some cash, and literally within an hour, prices really started to accelerate to the downside. Then we saw that big washout, and that's really kind of a good re-entry point there. But prices have just been bouncing around since then, edging up, and so I'm still a little bit cautious here all around in the big picture because we've cleared some resistance here to the downside, some prior resistance, now support, and prices have just barely held above that, but that's going to be an important level to be holding. And so this prior breakout point, and I mentioned in my last update, these two little wicks here were really kind of the must hold levels, basically 39.40, 39.50, and that did undercut but quickly bounced right back above. If prices can begin to just drift higher here, just like they did in the past here recently, where you see these big shakeouts, then they just continue higher, that'll be positive because that big wick, that undercut, really just kind of undercut a lot of potential stops here, maybe triggered some stop loss orders, people getting stopped out. But the bad news is the volume on that was very high. I mean, look at the volume on that here. That's big bearish reversal, big bearish engulfing candle. Generally a pretty good sell signal. The fact that it's still holding up above the trend line is positive, but prices are starting to roll over now. We're seeing a little bit of a bounce. It's looking a little bear flaggish in my opinion here, with this bounce just going into that 10 EMA. The 22 EMA is just right above at 39.93. And you can see the volume on this bounce, very timid, very weak. Now, granted, there was a lot of buying volume here at the lows, but just something to make note of. This is just kind of resetting some oversold conditions on the short term, potentially setting up for a bounce, bear flag type action, and then a retest of the lows at least is what I'm looking for here in the near term. So just something to make note of. Now on the positive, if you look at the daily chart, let me clear this parallel channel here for us. There we go. Now if you look at the daily chart on the positive, you can see prices are still holding above the 2 key moving averages. Prices did briefly dipped below the 10 EMA on the daily chart, have since bounced pretty nicely here up in the upper half of this wide daily range here today. And so that is positive, the fact that it's holding up, but you're starting to see a little bit of attempt of the sellers starting to take hold, a little bit of pressure, especially in the shorter time frames. It's not looking positive from that perspective. And so just something to make note of. Daily chart still hasn't turned. The trend is still your friend, still making higher lows, but I am absolutely getting more cautious here. I did raise some cash here going into this dip. Now that it's bounced, selling a little bit more into that bounce, and I'm going to wait to see how this plays out. I mean, if it just continues higher, we'll continue to recover. I have no problem just scaling back in, jumping in there, just because there was a little bit of a gain had during this big sell-off. Now, looking at the alts, some of them are holding up much better than others, as we saw here on the watch list. The first one is IOTA, holding up very nicely. If you look at the daily chart here, big base starting to form here. Look at the volume pattern showing up on this guy too. The last daily candle, very strong volume as it recovers. Nice bullish engulfing candle here, taking out some near-term resistance, starting to test this next level here on the way up. But all in all, looking pretty good here. If Bitcoin holds up, this is one I'm going to be watching for some more potential upside. On the USD side, it's also looking very strong from that perspective, looking similar. Let's pull that up real quick. You can see here just nice big base starting to form, higher high starting to set place, and there is some testing of resistance here right around that 32-cent mark essentially on the USD tether pair. And so definitely set up for a breakout. If it can break out, the next target on the way up here on the USD pair is going to be that 38-cent mark. And then what I'm looking for is basically 44 cents, maybe 50, but I'm not quite looking at that just yet, just kind of looking at these first near-term resistance levels. So definitely there's some things holding up, as we mentioned. Raven just blasting through all resistance, powering higher, making a new relative high, taking out this swing high that we saw at the beginning of the month. Nice pullback to the moving averages and just powering high on very strong volume. So nice to see. By far one of the strongest names out there in light of the selling pressure that we saw here today. So Ravencoin moving up, as well as Ethereum Classic, which is kind of surprising. And we did cover this one in the Monday live stream and looked at it as a potential low being formed. I'm generally not too excited about Ethereum Classic. I don't tend to trade it a whole lot, but hey, nevertheless, it is looking pretty good here in the near term. But let's take a look at some of these others here very quickly. Looking at ETH, BTC here first. I mentioned in my last video there was two levels I was watching. This lower trend line, which is now breached on today's selling pressure, but it did hold that horizontal price support. Still holding there, so this little zone here, we'll see if that can continue to hold up as some near-term resistance here. Looking at Litecoin BTC pair, still holding up pretty good in light of the selling pressure here again. Now, notice this is versus BTC, so of course if the price of Bitcoin is dropping, so will the USD pair on the Litecoin side, but versus BTC, holding up pretty good, which is not usually what you see. When Bitcoin has a big sell-off, many of these names will sell off with a higher percentage to the downside and lead the way down, just like they will on the way up. So high beta name generally holding out versus BTC, kind of just holding its own, but still looking pretty good here. If we look at BNB versus BTC, that one is rolling over here a little bit. I mentioned this one here a few days back. I was looking at this hanging man candle that was developing right at that trend line. It did finally break, and you can see here the last couple days just drifting lower, right at support now here, this prior breakout point, testing that right now, looking at this little wick bouncing. But so far these moving averages are now inverted, meaning the 10 EMA is below the 22 EMA. It's also breaking this trend, breaking a little bit of near-term support, and the moving averages are starting to slope lower. And so a little bit of a cautionary there. It is following through to the downside, following that big selling signal that I saw here a few days back. Look at the volume that showed up on that sell signal. And so generally you want to pay attention to those type of moves when you see that. And now we're seeing some more downside follow through. Next stop, if it breaks this support level, there's a small support level right here, but below that could likely test this next breakout point down here on that 3100 level. So just something to make note of. It looks like that potentially was a little bit of a distribution top, and as I mentioned, in the big picture, very strong, has had a tremendous rally, and it's just not surprising to see a little bit of pullback, little profit taking on the daily and the weekly charts. A few others here real quick. Omise Go, OMG, still looking pretty good. Had that nice breakout move yesterday. Pretty much was a quick scalp trade for me. Took some of the gains here into this prior resistance. You can see there was some resistance showing up here. Sold about 60% of the position into that. Held some of that, raised the stop, and today got out of the rest of it once BTC started to break down. So I'm out of this one here for now, but still looking at it, holding up relatively well, but bouncing a little bit right now and looking like maybe a little double top. So just keep an eye on this one here, but holding up better than most right now. Looking at Stellar Lumens. I mentioned this one that after they got listed on on Coinbase here, that was this spike back here. In my opinion, it was a sellable rally, especially since it had already broken out in that week and had already had a decent run. Felt exhausted, looked like any kind of moves to the upside at this point were just kind of some profit-taking sells, and that's looking like the way it's playing out. That was the Coinbase day. It did pull back after that, had another quick pop here, and just barely made a new higher high, quickly sold into, and now it's rolling over here. So at this point, I'm just staying away from the BTC pair. I'm going to see if it settles out here, but it's looking like a little bit of a double top. Odds favor a little bit more downside testing. First support is basically right below current pricing, and then of course all the way back down to the prior breakout point here. So stellar lumens, it is pulling back here, seeing some profit taking right into this prior support, which is now resistance. And so just very often we see that, and I mentioned this over and over again, when you're doing projections and when you're looking at upside targets, I mean, the most obvious levels are always prior support turned resistance, and look at where these very often will play out. And so when I'm selling and I'm taking profits into these moves, I'm generally selling before they get to those points. Then I'll hold a little bit, see if it can break through, but usually that's where a lot of traders are showing up and they're selling into that. So just keep that in mind. It's just very common. You see this very often, and it's playing out almost perfectly here on this stellar lumens trade. So going back to Bitcoin for now, just going to be patient, see how this one plays out here over the next couple of days. I mean, keep in mind, it's had a pretty good run. It's still edging up, but there's this big resistance level right here, this big top that formed. Prices have since bounced a good ways up towards that, seeing a little bit of resistance here. And the fact that we saw this big bullish, or excuse me, this big bearish engulfing reversal on some pretty high volume is making me much more cautious now. And so just something to keep in mind. One thing I'm going to be watching here today is this bounce that's playing out here as I record this. How does it act as it approaches this moving average pair, which is basically sub 4K on this Coinbase exchange? So this price action teetering out into 4K, potentially pulling back again. That's what I'm going to be watching on a pullback. Best case scenario, you get a higher low and then prices just continue to edge higher. So that's what I'm going to be watching, paying attention to here over the next couple of days. Wanted to bring that update. I will be doing a live stream tomorrow, and so look out for that. I'll post that and send out a tweet when that's ready to rock. And until next time, take care, everyone.